Welcome to Catalytic Curiosity. I am your host, Jaymes with a Y O'Farron with Catalytic Conversations. I serve remote professionals and hybrid organizations with coaching, consulting, and training to help them reconcile humanity and technology, leading to healthier, digitally integrated lives and teams. On this podcast, I am embarking on a journey of discovery to unearth the roots of digital mastery and maturity beyond mere adulting. I interview insightful and intriguing experts exploring how we can develop sage-like maturity with intention in today's digitized world. Today's episode brings Father Paul Hodge to the table to talk about listening. Father Paul Hodge is principal at Hodge Leadership Coaching, also Internal Coach and Facilitator at Orthodox Christian Leadership Initiative. He's also an Orthodox Christian presbyter and pastor for 26 years now. I met Father Paul when he actually came up to my parish and covered for our priest, and he went on vacation. So we were able to connect really well over pizza, over dinner, and it's been an amazing relationship that we've developed since then. I've been really excited to have him on here. During our conversation, we talked about listening and coaching as a service profession distinct from other professions or ministries that use listening as a primary tool, like therapy, consulting, or counseling. We also talked about listening and how it changes and doesn't change in different environments, like in Zoom or over the phone. And finally, we discussed how defensive mindsets can be more subtle than we expect and cripple our ability to connect authentically, and how powerful listening can be to overcome that. So buckle up and join us for Catalytic Curiosity. Well, Father Paul, thank you so much. Welcome to Catalytic Curiosity. I've been really excited about pulling together all these different people, and you are one of the first people that came to my mind when I was thinking I want somebody to talk about and learn from in this conversation about all kinds of things relevant to maturity. As a priest, someone that I look up to, as someone who's kind of a professional in maturity development in many ways. That's so important to me to be able to click with, resonate with, and learn from people like you in my profession, but also as a spiritual advisor in many ways too. So
Wow,
thank you again so much for coming on.
You're very welcome. You know the story about the rabbi who was lost in the woods for 30 days?
Maybe not, probably don't.
So some of his congregants stumbled upon him in the woods, and he said, "Oh, thank God, I can, you've rescued me." They said, "No, we're lost, Rabbi, but thank God we found you because you can show us how to get out." He said, "How long have you been lost?" They said, 3 days. He said, "I've been here 30. So I can show you all the ways not to go."
I love it.
Yeah. So, or the guy in the amusement park with the T-shirt that says, "I'm a great dad. I show my kids all the things not to do."
This is true. I know. I will likely be that kind of a dad.
Yeah.
But you are a coach and a priest, and you coach in an interesting intersection of those two roles. So as a brief introduction, like a little bit about your niche, what you do, and why you do it. What's your passion there?
Sure. So much of leadership in church life and probably nonprofits in general is founded on the notion of the teaching expert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone who knows the Bible, someone who knows the church tradition, who knows the liturgy, who is imparting this to the flock, right? Who's leading people by experience, expertise, example. And so often what happens is people aren't ready for that. They're not engaged on some level. There's a missing piece. So that person who's intending to lead with all this expertise and experience turns around to see no one's following. And in fact, they're just a guy out for a walk. There's no cohesion. The constituency is not empowering the leadership.
Right.
So after some of those challenges myself, I can't say it wasn't an intentional thing where I set out to kind of make a difference, but I was asked to take on a facilitating role through the Orthodox Christian Leadership Initiative. And also through that, I was sort of identified by people in the peer group as someone who could coach them. And I was invited then to coach. And so I started learning about, what does that mean to coach? What is this listening profession?
I
And
got
it
promoted by your
was,
clients in a sense.
yeah, in a sense,
It happens a
like
lot.
sort of, axios, like, which is, he is worthy, just offered up, like, you're going to do this now, and
I guess I better learn how.
yeah, exactly. And so it really, like, you talk about an intersection, it really opened up a creative perspective for me, which is that you get that engagement, you get that following generated from the constituency through listening,
Yes.
through seeing the world through the perspective of that person, without judgment, which is what does the Lord say? Judge not, lest you be judged. So there's a real kind of ethical thing that's already in the tradition. There's this sense of compassion, of being there for the other, coming alongside, being a co-creator, being a co-partner, all these jargon words. It's already there. And coaching unlocks that in the ministry in a way that nothing else I've encountered has done.
That's beautiful. That really segues nicely into kind of the topic that we were talking about beforehand, about listening and how powerful listening is as a service, as a ministry in so many ways. And people think so often, unfortunately, of listening as like a passive endeavor. Like I'm just sitting there and I'm just receiving whatever saying, and that the active role is primarily that of the speaker. But one thing that I've talked about, I've done workshops on being a conversationalist and helping people learn how to communicate better in a conversation. And I always ask was like, who do you think the leader is in a conversation? Is it the person who's talking, or the person who's asking the questions that's directing the flow of who is talking? And when people think about it, like for a moment, like, oh, well, yeah, it's the person who's asking the questions, who's directing the conversation. That's obvious leader, but he's not doing a lot of the talking. He's just asking questions, sometimes even subtly guiding it, even just by body language, not saying anything at all, but by intently listening, activating the other person and helping them to speak better.
Yeah, the active part of it, it's the origin of the word coach, right? It's a carriage. It's a artifice that
I had not even thought of that. So that's so true.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the coach is like your professional leadership life, whatever you're getting coaching on, Uber driver. You get in and you say,
yes,
take me to my destination. And the driver says, sure, absolutely. And then he has some experience with the map, with the road, making sure you avoid obstacles, with helping you to understand. Maybe you, through the conversation with your driver, you say, oh gosh, you know what? I need to stop at the grocery store first. And then you end up with a maybe even revising your destination.
It's a collaborative partnership, and it's ultimately driven by the client.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
That was the next point I wanted to make. Is unlike other helping or listening professions, it's strongly client driven.
Yeah,
it's not a training, it's not a counseling or therapy, because in those cases with counseling and therapy, they tend to be present or past focused.
Right.
Coaching is future oriented, or future focused, action oriented.
Yeah. I've used the analogy
not
of like,
you're not looking to fix something, you're looking
exactly
to arrive somewhere. Yeah.
I've used that analogy of like, therapy is there to kind of get rid of the barriers and like the anchors that are holding you back that's in your past. And coaching is like clearing the pathway forward in front of you to help clear that pathway so you can see where you walk next.
Yeah. And it might very well be that through being coached, you discover an obstacle for which you need therapy or
they're totally synergistic.
And so then you go for that modality. In fact, I had a client, just on a very high level, not to break any confidentiality, but the coaching we did, we got to the desired destination. We had the conversation, are we going to continue with more goals? And the answer was, I got to work on me in a different way. And I'm going to do this through therapy and so forth. So that was great.
So the way forward for him was therapy in that way.
Yeah. The funny thing about coaching is you try to work yourself out of a job. So,
right.
you know.
So that sounds like success to me.
Yeah. Yes. We're done now, good. Well done.
All of these different things, like you mentioned counselors, you mentioned therapists, consultants, coaches, also pastoral, ministerial type things as well.
Pastor, spiritual advisor, there's that role too, that people often have that relationship in their life, which has more of the coaching mode
a little bit,
perhaps
included
than the others, but it still is coming from the perspective of the spiritual advisor or pastor as an expert.
Right.
There's which still is the power differential, if you will, or the hierarchy that, really in the coaching relationship, unlike all these other other relationships of helping or listening, it's the client who has the power.
Right.
Whereas it
doesn't go anywhere if they're not providing the power and the investment into it.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And so they get out of it what they put into it.
Exactly. And you act kind of like a force multiplier, but if you put zero in, you can't multiply 0 by 0. What do you get?
Exactly. No, you help with the blind spots, the focus, the challenging questions, the helping someone to work through the old saying, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Which is our default setting typically.
If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, Father, we tried that already and it didn't work.
Right. Oh man. So looking at these different kind of service professions that involve listening, they listen in different ways though, because different relational dynamics to how they listen. Like there's that power differential that you mentioned, like whether it's hierarchical or expertise related. What are some other dimensions in a sense that differentiate different kinds of listening, do you think?
That's a really good question. Well, in the other listening professions, it's the expectation is typically that the client will be listening to the trainer, teacher, consultant. The information is flowing from expertise and experience toward, growth and development. In the case of the coach, the expertise and experience belongs to the client. And they're in an active process of learning from their own existing expertise and experience, how to develop those things, how to accomplish goals that they desire, how to fulfill mandates and requirements that they may have in their job. For example, if you're managing as a coach, you're not a professional coach, you're a manager in an organization, you're coaching your direct reports to meet the targets that are assigned by the business or by the organization, but they're doing it from their own ownership of the task, rather than being told, sold, and scolded.
Right.
And
that's kind of like
so there's
you're listening to draw out.
Yeah. So to get back to your original question, there's a different flow of flow of listening. It's the coach is actively listening so that the client or the person being coached can better listen to their own story or their own.
They can hear themselves better.
And hear themselves better. Yes.
And you mentioned that something that's really important. I was actually going to get into this next, so it's just we're going real nicely here. You have a manager who is coaching their direct reports, right? You have coaching involved, even if you're not just exclusively, I'm coaching a client. There's a coaching relationship, and it's explicitly that's what we're doing, right?
Right.
But coaching as a skill can and should be incorporated into all these other things as well. It should be part of that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, that's something with my clients, we discuss at times as it comes up in their conversation about when they say something about, this is really great, this is amazing. I at some point in the conversation, I say, and you can do it too.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Like you're learning an approach to certain relationships. You can do it with family. You can, when your spouse has or a child, of a certain maturity, right? Like not a young child, but an older child or a young adult has a challenge in their life, you can approach it as a coach. You can start asking some clarifying questions. You can help them to, there's this great video that I was shown a few years ago. You've probably seen it. It's a young man and a young woman sitting on the couch having a conversation, and the camera is behind them.
Right.
And she's talking about how she has this splitting headache.
Yes.
And then also that whenever she puts her sweater on, she gets a tear in her sweater. And it's like, what is she talking about? And as the camera comes around to the front, the young man says, "Dear, you have a nail in your forehead." They see this giant nail in her forehead.
But don't fix me. I don't want you to fix me.
And she's like, "I don't need you to solve my problems.
I just want you to listen and empathize."
And that listening and that empathy is the foundation of coaching. Now, the expectation is that the person with the nail in their head would also be looking for ways either to cope with it or remove it, or to creatively work through some change and in the direction of growth and development. In there,
it's kind of a merging of, because you have that. I love that video. Actually, I was just talking. I showed it to a new guy just yesterday. It's hilarious, or no, day before yesterday. But you have like it's like a humorous contrast between two different listening styles. One is listening to speak versus listening just to hear. But coaching is like a merging of the two, like where I'm listening to empathize and see where you're at and walk with you, but I'm also here to fix, but not by telling, but by asking.
Yeah. And that's the third. There are three ways to listen. Most of us spend our time in the first two, which is just distracted listening. You're talking to me and I'm looking at my phone and thinking about my next appointment, and I'm saying, oh yeah, cool. Oh, wow, really? Oh yeah, hang on a sec. I got to take this call,
Right.
And then the second form is like logical listening. You're just getting the content,
the data transfer,
intuition. You're not connecting with the person. You're not giving them a sense of value, that they have something to say. That's that is trivial as it may be in the grand scheme. It's important because they're saying it. So then what you just referred to is that third kind of listening, where you take a pause. You use the words that the person speaking uses. You don't interpret. You don't elaborate. You don't jump to. You may know, like it may be so obvious. Like, well, here's what you need to do.
Right.
But you don't offer that. You let the person find their way. And then you encourage and reward and praise and congratulate when they find that satisfying answer. Say, you did it.
Yeah. I think they get so much more out of it, and it's so much more investment, because that leads to more implementation, more action, because they have that clear that they arrived at themselves. And have more personal investment in it. Absolutely.
Well, right. The psychological concept of reactance. When I was a kid, I played the saxophone in the high school band, and part of our course was to practice 30 minutes a day. And you tracked it on a pad. And so I would be literally walking into my space where I was going to practice, and I would hear my mom say, "Don't forget to practice your saxophone." And I would turn around and walk the other way. Because now it wasn't me who was choosing to do it. It was someone else giving me the instruction. And I didn't I was an adolescent too, but I wanted that independence. I wanted that ability to choose for myself, to own the outcome. And that's huge as a leader and as a coach. To cultivate that.
Dale Carnegie talked about it in How to Win Friends and Influence People. Like, make it their idea. Like, if you just come
not
and
in
hand people this, not in a manipulative way,
but not in a collaborative way. Like, because it really is their idea.
Exactly.
Like, allow it to be their idea.
Yeah.
And again, when there's a difference between coaching it as a mode of relationship, as an approach to a relationship, coaching as a profession, where there's an agreement, there's a contract, there's money changing hands, it's making a living, and coaching as a leadership style where you're managing as a coach,
right.
So performance coaching.
Because then you can kind of mix it in a little bit. Because it's not, I'll sometimes describe like swapping hats sometimes. Like, if they're wanting, consulting as well, and I have expertise in a particular area, sometimes they may want me to swap out because they don't have that answer. And, they could walk through it and take a super long time to, get there, but they want, here's the expertise answer. And in some situations you can mix it in there if that's explicit in the relationship, and you can mix it up.
Yeah,
but
you can ask permission. You can
ask permission to swap out. Exactly.
Can
as
I
needed.
talk to you as a consultant for a moment? Would that be all right? Can I, I love what you're saying. It's making a ton of sense. Do you mind if I augment one of those points?
Mm-hmm.
It just something has struck me that I'd like to share. Is that okay with you?
Mm-hmm. Because and the way you're asking that is still very much making sure that they have the power.
Right.
That they still own that relationship. Absolutely.
Right. And they might say, I've got this. Thank you. But usually people are like, oh yeah, I welcome the input.
Right.
And then, when you say this is a perspective I'm sharing with you, but in no way, like any advice, you can take it or leave it. So, and it's rare. It's giving advice is not coaching.
Right. Exactly. I love this. I work kind of being able to present this to people to help how they can incorporate it into their lives and include these skills in just day-to-day life, parenting or other relationships. But let's transition a little bit and kind of pivot and look at listening in different contexts, because we talked about, as different ways of serving on that level, but listening also changes depending on the environment that we're working in. And we were talking about earlier about how I was just recently doing a self-assessment on my own communication skills. And I observed that, I've gotten really good at presenting before an audience. I'm great at, facilitating in group discussions or participating in group discussions, one-on-ones, whether on Zoom or in person. I've developed those skills. I'm a millennial. I like chatting and instant messaging. I prefer Discord to Slack in some ways, but I know the nuances of how to do this other bit differently. I get text messaging and its own little niche there, and all these different things like that, and emails. But one thing I found, like, I haven't developed hardly at all, and I still, honestly, I kind of think I kind of suck at it. I need to really double down on improving this. Priority for me, once I noticed this, is phone conversations. Talking on the phone is something that I haven't had a tremendous amount of need to do, because it's always been through instant messaging or in person.
Why phone when you can text?
Exactly, or Zoom
leave
call.
A note on the fridge, and then the person comes by and reads it and leaves you a note. It's
just go back. My wife and I do that all the time.
Yeah.
Sticky notes on the door.
I had a choir director who texted me and said, "Do you have contact information for this other priest?" And I texted back, "Yeah, his phone number is." And then, you could see the 3 little dots, on the text, and they just were going and going. And it's like, I don't really know how to say this in a way that isn't embarrassing, but I meant like, or no, what was it? Something like, no, he used the phone number, obviously. I said, "Here's the phone number. Why don't you give him a call?" And then he sort of like hemmed and hawed, and he wrote back. He's like, "Yeah, people my age don't do that." Like, that's really, like, I hadn't even thought of it until you mentioned it.
Of actually calling him.
Yeah, like with the device that you have in your hand,
the thing that we call a phone
on it,
right? Which is named after sound. Like, it means sound, but we don't use it for that.
So it's the assumptions, and that, I think that underscores what we were talking about a minute ago, which is we have assumptions about communication that they're habitual, and that applies to, sending and receiving messages in a transactional way. And it applies to our listening.
Absolutely. Because talking in all these different, like, I can talk on the phone, right? But listening on the phone can be very challenging, because there's all the other information, all the other visual stimuli that can distract me. There's all those natural lulls in conversation that are just comfortable in person, because that they're still present with you. But if you have that on the phone, like, well, is the phone not working anymore? Did they fall off? Are they mad at me? Are they distracted? You don't know. There's not much feedback there, so it gets awkward.
Yeah,
and so knowing how to transition
suddenly, or in the car trying to navigate traffic? You don't know.
Right.
You can't see.
Exactly.
Same thing, on the Zoom calls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Zoom as opposed to in person. In person, there's a synchronization between my words and my eyes. I'm looking you in the face. I'm looking, and we have different ways of making eye contact. So if it's cultural. The Arabs I speak to, you make eye contact, you keep eye contact. Zoom, in order to do that, you have to do what I'm doing right now, which is stare just above the camera at a little picture of my own face that's on the screen, or I can switch it around and have your face there.
Right.
But if I look at you, I'm over here, and then you don't see me looking at you.
Right.
One so thing that's a challenge.
It's a challenge, yeah. One thing that I've actually done, for listeners, there's actually a tip that I use for this. I tell people, so I have my camera like right above, right here.
Yep.
Okay. And so I have my Zoom window, and I structure it so that I have you right underneath it.
Yep. Me too.
Right. Yeah. And so what I've noticed is that if it's slightly off, right, we all notice eyes changing a lot this direction, right? If I look away askance, that's like I'm not connected. But if I look right here, I'm not actually technically looking at the camera. I'm looking slightly between you and the camera.
This works well for a one-on-one Zoom call.
Yes. If you have a whole crowd, I have to rearrange the tiles constantly. Who's talking now? Move them up.
Yeah, it's and then if you have the camera, like I have a separate camera, it's not attached to the monitor or the laptop.
Right.
And so then it's in front of the screen. And then someone puts a screen share, and then all of a sudden your head's moving to the
all
side.
over the place. Like, what's going on here?
Not to get lost in the weeds on this, but to make the point that you're going to adjust your listening style to the medium in which you're communicating. And you can even be a good listener through text messages.
Yes.
By not assuming tone of voice, by assuming positive intent, by not assuming,
that is
the
so
stance the person is standing in while they're dictating a text or typing a text.
I was just reading a conversation on Messenger with a group of friends, and one of them in particular got really upset and was just arguing back and forth and calling the person arrogant and challenging to block him and all this kind of stuff. And I was really like, wow, what did he say? And I was reading back through, like expecting him to have said something horrible, right? I was like, I actually kind of agree with that. Like that didn't that wasn't that big of a deal. But I was reading back through, and I was like, oh, he interpreted it that way, which isn't what he actually said. Right. But because of his assumptions, because of he was triggered by it on a particular interpretation, and he threw it, and he couldn't see the other side. He didn't assume positive intent and assumed all kinds of horrible intent, and it blew up like crazy.
Yeah, I just came across this quote from Pentagon spokesman Robert McCloskey back in the late 60s, early 70s during a press briefing about the Vietnam War. He said to the reporter, "I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant."
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Like so many things going on, right? Like what I think I'm saying, what you think I'm saying, what I think you think I'm saying, it's just like there's 6 people in the conversation.
Basically, in church history class, Father Will was talking about how interpretation of a text, right? You have to look at the world that they're writing of, right? Because the person who's writing was writing from a previous place, right? But then also the world that he's in, and then our world that we're reading from, and we're bringing that into the interpretation as well. And they're like this huge crossover event, right, of interaction between all these different perspectives and worldviews. And you have to kind of parse out, okay, what is that from me that I'm bringing in here? Is that from his world, or is it from the actual world that he's trying to talk about? Or how do these all interplay? And it's complicated and challenging. Which is where you want to look at it from multiple perspectives. You want to get multiple points of data because you can't go off of one thing. That's one thing you're talking about with texting. How do you listen on text? And it goes back to coaching. You ask clarifying questions.
Yeah.
Right. You ask questions. Did you mean this? Did you mean that? Or tell me more.
Or you respond. if you don't have time, or, if it's just a transactional communication,
Mm-hmm.
you just respond assuming the best of intent, so that
Yes.
you're not being misunderstood.
Right.
And then triggering someone else.
Mm-hmm. Which never improves the communication situation.
Eventually, one of the two of you will be accused of being Adolf Hitler, and that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, pretty much.
So that's where the inevitable. I mean, that's where it inevitably
it always ends up
doing
there.
this back and forth. One of you is a horrible, evil, monster, and that's it. It's QED, right?
Yep.
Proven right here in this conversation.
Absolutely. Which actually kind of cycles back to a concept that I bring up a lot about humanhood and bringing our humanhood into conversations, because when we're limited in like the bandwidth of the dimensions of our humanhood, whether it's sight or physical touch or taste, if we're not eating together and so on, we're limiting kind of the bandwidth of how much of us we can bring. So we have to bring more of an emotional awareness to kind of compensate and create more alignment. But if you start getting defensive and not assuming positive intent, we're actually dehumanizing the other person.
Right.
All to the point of Adolf Hitler, right?
We're affected. What it is that is just a stand-in for the whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a German National Socialist from the 40s.
Yeah.
But something that stands in for the biggest fear, the thing that you would either flee from or fight, because you're in that part of your brain
Offensive.
where you've shut down your higher thinking ability, and you're being flooded with stress hormones, testosterone. You're just, you're ready to go, either fight or flee or appease, or just freeze, like an iguana. Sometimes, if an iguana gets challenged just enough, its eyes glaze over and it sort of plays dead. It just freezes there.
You mentioned
that's not communication. That's some kind of primal, existence.
Autonomic nervous system type responses. Yeah. You mentioned appease, and this is, I want to circle on this one a little bit, actually, because so often people, they know about flight, they know about fight. Sometimes they also know, the freeze response. Hardly anybody talks about appease as a defensive reaction. But I think it's so critical that we do understand it as that, because when we interact with somebody in a defensive capacity and we give up ourselves, right? We're just like throwing down, like we're tearing down our barriers and our boundaries and giving over to somebody. We're surrendering up whatever in order to appease them. That's not constructive. That's not actually listening. That's not connection. That's not engaging. That's not building a relationship. It's a defensive, destructive cycle.
Yeah. Now we're
codependence.
It is, and it becomes it is initially very rewarding for both parties, because it seems to resolve a conflict.
Yeah.
But it becomes less and less effective the longer the strategy is employed.
Right.
And because it doesn't ever get you out of that stress place, to get you into the, the other brain chemicals on the other side of things, up in the prefrontal cortex, right? To be sort of, pseudoscientific about it, but to be more spiritual about it. It's in those moments when you are being threatened in a communication, when you are feeling, not literally like someone say, I'm going to hurt you, but you're having that response. You threatened. You have a job, you make a living, you have benefits, you have, if this conversation doesn't go the way you want it to, it's not the end of the world. But your organism is telling you, this is an existential crisis. I could live or die here, and I have to fight or run away, right? Or the other things, freeze or appease. And it's in that moment when you, as the listener, can suspend that reaction, choose a response, because you have that freedom.
You do.
And then allow the person you're communicating with to get out of that trap too. You give them space as well.
Yeah.
And if you ask a question, okay, this happened to me once renting a car. I was on some kind of I just had a lot of stress, and I needed to take a trip that I wasn't really excited about taking. And we had one car and it had to stay. So I had to budget to rent the car. And I went into the rental place, and I thought, just Tuesday, right? I'm just here. It's Tuesday. I'm renting a car. And the manager of the store was called over by the person at the desk. And he said to me, I am perceiving a lot of hostility coming from you right now. I want to know how we can best help you in this situation. And I literally took a step back. And I said, really? I don't perceive myself as being hostile. But I said, I don't want to be hostile toward you. I just want to rent a car. So let me detach from whatever was on my mind that you don't have anything to do with, and talk to you like a human being. There's that humanhood you were
right
earlier. And what an epiphany, what a revelation that moment was. Like, I had no idea I was being a complete jerk. Like, literally no idea.
Right.
It just felt normal to me because maybe I was just passing it along,
I love their response to it though. That was that's so perfect. Like, we're sensing this from you. Please leave. It's we're sensing from you. How can we help you in this situation?
Yeah.
That's beautiful, because so much you mentioned that about when you're listening and you're feeling defensive, and then you respond in a way that helps the other person possibly escape that same trap.
And that's what happened. And then it was like a great, business transaction. They were able to get me the car I wanted. There was trust.
Yes.
Because
there's like a shared vulnerability there, because that's always what builds to trust. Yeah.
That's
a beautiful story. And that's so critical though. And you're thinking about, because we get defensive all the time. We don't notice it because it's invisible to us until it's called to our attention or we notice it. It's really hard to train ourselves to be aware of our own defensive reactions. But particularly if the more subtle ones, like freezing or appeasing, because we're like, I'm being nice. Like, well, you might actually just being defensive.
It's like a kind of false humility. We talk about that in some of the group trainings that we do with our Orthodox Christian Leadership Initiative. When you're talking about teamwork and team building, the people who go to the false humility just to appease, or those who seize false authority because, they claim some legitimacy or some source of their power that's external to whatever constitutes the organization. They're an expert. Their parents, their grandparents, were the major donors, founded the organization. And so they have this authority thereby, but it has nothing to do with the team. It has nothing to do with the organization per se. That is those. I'm glad you pointed out that those are more subtle, but they are defensive. They are on the lower primal level of function. They're not, when you're in that prefrontal mind, like when someone trusts you, and you're free to be vulnerable and to make mistakes and to learn from them, you feel well-being. You feel a kind of, not elation in the sense of like euphoria, but openness to the world. You feel competent. You feel connected. Like you have fellowship with others. You have a common cause. You share, you share the same struggle, and you bond over facing the same adversity. And so there's a humanness to it that's more elevated and more refined and more cultivated. We're not limited. We're not intended to be limited to just kind of a reptilian, eating.
No.
No.
Yeah, I bring this up actually a lot dealing with burnout, because when you look at the characteristics of burnout, you've got the alienation or the cynicism that disconnect relationally. You have the exhaustion and overwhelm, because your capacity is overstretched, and there's also an inefficacy, like a lack of sense of accomplishment and confidence in your own ability, like the imposter syndrome. Those are the three core elements of burnout, but those all are defensive mindsets. They're removing that capacity to connect and engage in all things you were just describing. So people are living in this defensive mindset chronically, and they're incapable of thinking creatively, of connecting, of collaborating, working outside of the box, troubleshooting, which particularly for if you're, a knowledge professional. If you can't troubleshoot, if you can't think creatively, you're out of a job, right? It's dangerous.
So, I was thinking the other day, you talk about that these are defensive reactions, and I was thinking about, or actually reading about, what are they reactions to? And let me ask you if this sounds like it fits. Burnout is the response to thousands of minor betrayals.
Ooh.
Each betrayal in itself isn't enough to break the relationship.
Right.
But as they accumulate, you become habitually defensive. You have these protective behaviors that you're trying to maintain your own autonomy, your own efficacy on your own, and you're not being enhanced or endorsed or empowered in those ways by the others around you.
I think you're absolutely right. And that what hits so hard for me is, as I work with hybrid workforces as well, and helping them to create connection between the people who are working remotely and people who are working in person. And you don't set out to alienate the people that you hire remotely. That's not your goal. But instinctively, unconsciously, we connect more to the people who are in person because we have more bandwidth to operate with, right? But what that translates to for those remote employees are thousands of micro betrayals. And that builds up directly into burnout.
They're not getting the dopamine surge that you and I are experiencing right now by talking about something that interests both of us.
Yeah. They're not connecting. They're not engaging, which can happen online. If you are intentional, you assume the best intentions in other people, and instead of assuming the worst by asking intentional questions to draw them out and engage with them, listen intentionally. You can do that in any medium because we're both human, even in those different mediums. But we have to be more intentional about it because we don't. Even in person, we don't do it by default.
So is this getting back then to our earlier talk about different modes of communication and adjusting your relational or active listening?
I think so.
Between a in-person hire and a remote hire in the example you gave.
Yeah, I think so, because it takes a lot more work in general to connect in online digital mediums. But as someone who never, I've noticed my communication ability improves with somebody I interact with via text if I've heard their voice, even over the phone, right? Or if I met somebody in person, so much the better. Now, when I interact with them online via text, just a stripped down, bare text, just the data, right? I can then extrapolate from what I know of them, their mannerisms, the way they talk, the kind of idioms they use, what kind of tone of language they're using, and intersect those, assuming the best intention, the best interpretation of that intersection. And it brings it to life. But if you have somebody who's always been remote, and you don't have that kind of groundwork, I joke on particular, or just social networking as well, in social media. And people, the default voice that I think people generally have, if you assume that people have, is like a Dalek, monotone and angry. If you assume everything you said is being read as a Dalek reading it, then you can, if you add more words in to clarify your emotional intent.
But it just comes down to exterminate.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. This is why Facebook is toxic. Everybody's reading each other as Daleks. So you have to create more context. You have to ask more questions to rehumanize them, de-Dalekify them, I suppose you could say, and really specifically get to know them as a human, as a person on a deeper level. Because you can get almost all that just in a handshake in person, but you have to go out of your way to investigate that in someone who's remote.
I have a vague memory of Doctor Who defeating the Daleks and doing this with the sort of robot shell that had exposed the weak little Dalek inside, and there was this like bonding and this like you're free, like you can transcend this,
and it couldn't coexist with love.
And so I have this vague memory. It might not have been in the script, but I have this vague memory of Doctor Who doing exactly what you just described after the Daleks were conquered in the episode.
I think that was actually the first encounter of the Daleks in the reboot series with Eccleston.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. That was a powerful episode.
Yeah,
dealing with love and hate and the struggles between those two. And when you have a entity that has been so habituated to hate and then suddenly encountering love, and how that creates an existential crisis.
Yeah,
that's kind of what we do.
That's moving for you.
Yeah. I really appreciate our time. We covered some really amazing topics, a lot of really practical, helpful things as well, but also the mindset and the spiritual mindset that we should have when approaching in any technical communication medium, but it's still the same humanness that we need to bring to play. So I really love that perspective and insight. And I thank you for taking the time to this episode. And I look forward to hopefully many more in future with you. We have awesome conversations.
Good. Absolutely. Awesome. Yeah. We'll live and learn and come back with more things to share.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jaymes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you had your curiosity sparked to explore the subject with greater awareness or gained a valuable insight along the way. Take a look at the show notes for links for how you can find Father Paul, leave reviews wherever you can, and make sure to join the conversation on my Discord. Remember, community is the catalyst that drives lasting transformation. I'll see you in the next episode of Catalytic Curiosity.